This week, in wrestling history, we go back 44 years ago this week, on August 10th, 1977, just one day shy of his 24th birthday, Terry Bollea, going by the name Hulk Hogan, made his in-ring wrestling debut in Florida against Brian Blair. It was Hogan's very first match. Blair had only been in wrestling for about 6 weeks by this point himself. They were booked to go to a 15-minute time limit draw, and they were having what they thought was a great match. The people were really into it. The boys are all out by the curtain watching them, and they're heading for what they think are the final few moments of the match when all of a sudden they hear the ring announcer go, 15 minutes down, 15 minutes remaining. So unbeknownst to the two of them, the other wrestlers played a rib on them, and they had the ring announcer change it from a 15-minute match to a 30-minute match. And they were already exhausted by the 15-minute mark. Blair said that by the time it was over, it was the worst match that he had ever had. 41 years ago this week, on August 9th, 1980, the WWF hosted its third and final Showdown at Shea event from the former home of the New York Mets and the New York Jets, Shea Stadium in Flushing, Queens, before what was then the third largest pro wrestling audience in U.S. history. They had over 36,000 fans in the stadium. The first Showdown at Shea was held in 1972, the second one in 1976, which included a closed-circuit airing from Tokyo of the famous boxer versus wrestler match between Muhammad Ali and Antonio Inoki. Andre the Giant also wrestled Chuck Wepner that night in Shea in another boxer against wrestler match. But on this night, the card included Antonio Inoki defeating Larry Sharp, Tatsumi Fujinami retaining his WWF Junior Heavyweight title over Chavo Guerrero, Chavo Classic. Bob Backlund and Pedro Morales beat the Wild Samoans in a 2 out of 3 falls match to win the WWF Tag Team titles, which they were forced to vacate the next day due to a one-person, one-belt rule they had at the time, which meant that Backlund, who was the WWF champion, could not hold any other title, which begs the question why this was a title match in the first place. Why not just make this a non-title match? I don't really know the answer. Andre the Giant defeated Hulk Hogan back when the roles were reversed and Hogan was the heel, Andre was the babyface. And in the main event, Bruno Sammartino defeated Larry Zbyszko in a steel cage match, a match that stemmed from one of the greatest heel turns of all time. It often gets forgotten in history. It gets overlooked a lot. You know, when people think of heel turns, they think of Hulk Hogan joining the NWO, or they think of, Shawn Michaels causing Marty Jannetty to dive through the barbershop window to escape, or even Andre's turn on Hogan in '87. That was a legendary moment when he linked up with Bobby Heenan to challenge Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania. But Zbyszko in his Hall of Fame speech told the story about idolizing Bruno when he was younger and catching a glimpse of Bruno in his backyard in Pittsburgh one day, literally crawling through the hedges to get a better look. And Bruno had taken a liking to him and he helped get him his start in the business. So years later, when Larry was making his way up, Bruno was already on his way down. Zbyszko pitched an idea for Bruno to come out of retirement, because he was pretty much already retired from the ring. He would come out of retirement to work a program with Zbyszko, which is what happened. It was the teacher against the student. Zbyszko was tired in storyline of being in Bruno's shadow and being known only as Bruno's protege. So they had a friendly exhibition one week on TV, or what was supposed to be friendly. Bruno was frustrating him during the match, and so he turned on his hero. He took a chair, he bloodied him up. By today's standards, this would be pretty standard stuff, I guess, but back then, this was a very big deal. And those two guys made some money doing business together all around the Horn, including right here at Shea Stadium. 35 years ago this week, in St. Louis on August 9th, 1986, Ric Flair won the NWA World's Heavyweight Championship for the 5th time, defeating Dusty Rhodes with the figure 4 leg lock. Tully Blanchard had viciously attacked Dusty's leg 2 days prior in Kansas City, which set up Rhodes passing out here from the pain and having his shoulders pinned to the mat. 27 years ago this week, on August 13th, 1994, ECW presented its first ever Hardcore Heaven show from the ECW Arena in Philadelphia, with a very famous finish to the main event between Cactus Jack and Terry Funk, who fought to a no contest after Public Enemy interfered just 5 minutes into the match and attacked Terry Funk. The show was running late, and they had to wrap up on time because the building had midnight bingo. The ECW Arena was quite literally a bingo hall, so they had to wrap things up. Cactus refused to pin Funk off of the interference from Public Enemy. He wasn't going to win like that, so he joined with him in battling Rocco Rock and Johnny Grunge. In the ensuing melee, Funk called for the fans to throw chairs to them in the ring, and what followed was a chaotic scene of well over 100 chairs being tossed into the ring as the ring announcer desperately pleaded with the crowd to stop throwing chairs into the ring. And it was to no avail. More chairs came flying in. Public Enemy was literally buried underneath all of the chairs, and promoter Todd Gordon was said to be furious about this, as you would imagine. I mean, just due to the potential lawsuits that could have resulted from something like this and somebody getting hurt. He was not happy. The funniest part, though, is one of the chairs hit Terry Funk in the back of the head, and just the comical way that he sold it. That was the best part of this whole thing. But that allowed him to fall down and give him an excuse to roll out to the floor to try to protect himself. Paul Heyman must not have hated it as much as Todd Gordon did, because the footage of this made it into the intro for their hardcore TV show for years to come after this. But this was not the first chair-throwing incident instigated by Terry Funk. The first one came the month before this at their first ever Heatwave show at the end of a barbed wire match with Terry and Dory Funk Jr. against Public Enemy. Funk, that night, grabbed a microphone and he asked the crowd for a chair. And he got a chair. About 75 of them. All four men also brawled out into the parking lot that night at the same time that dozens of old people were waiting in line for their midnight bingo game. I can just picture Terry Funk brawling out of the building all bloody, wrapped in barbed wire, while Grandma arrives for her bingo game, wondering if she's come to the wrong side of town. 25 years ago this week, on August 10th, 1996... WCW presented the first ever Hog Wild pay-per-view, an outdoor show from Sturgis, South Dakota, the site of the annual Sturgis Motorcycle Rally. This was an Eric Bischoff idea. Eric loves motorcycles, and he used to ride them a lot. So he thought it would be cool to ride the 8 hours down there on his bike to do a pay-per-view in front of thousands of bikers who clearly did not follow the product. They were honking their horns and revving their engines the entire time. A crowd that Bischoff on his 83 Weeks podcast suggested was made up mostly of everyday folks like doctors, lawyers, and engineers. They made no money on ticket sales because there were no ticket sales, although Bischoff claims the sponsorship opportunities that the show generated with automotive advertisers far exceeded whatever they would have made on the live gate. But a lot of the wrestlers hated it. I've heard Kevin Nash in particular and Conan talk about how logistically the show was just a friggin' nightmare. Nash said there were no locker rooms, they had to change in empty shipping containers, and the closest hotels were about 100 miles away in Wyoming. Bobby Heenan, who was doing commentary on the show with Dusty Rhodes and Tony Schiavone. Bobby Heenan, I love the brain, but he was clearly shit-faced for much of this pay-per-view. It got progressively more noticeable as the show went on, right into the main event when he was starting to talk very low and he was slurring some of his words. The guy was hammered. Tony Schiavone was sitting right next to him. He never saw him take a drink during the pay-per-view. Doesn't mean he didn't. Maybe he had a flask hidden away somewhere, or he could have done all of his drinking before the show, which is very possible. But he never saw him actually drinking during the pay-per-view. But he said he also sounded like he was either drunk, to him, or on pain pills. But in spite of the crowd, Chris Benoit and Dean Malenko had a very good match. In their match against the Steiner brothers, Harlem Heat got a ton of heat from the crowd. Hoo boy! These folks were revving their engines for Booker and Stevie. For all the wrong reasons. Stevie Ray on his podcast a few years ago compared what he and Booker felt like being there to being in Charlottesville. Which is a hell of a comparison to make. There were some people, and I don't want to stress some, I don't think it was the majority, but there were definitely people who were yelling racial slurs at them when the match was over. Some of them threw bottles and rocks at them on their way out. I imagine that if you would have told any of the people who did that Booker or Stevie were dating their daughter, they really would have been very unhappy. And Hollywood Hogan pinned the Giant to win the WCW World Championship, kicking off his year-long reign with the belt. This is where they spray-painted the NWO initials on the big gold belt for the first time. They desecrated the big gold belt. It's like sacrilege. They did 3 more of these Hog Wild shows before they finally gave up. They actually changed the name to Road Wild after this show due to a trademark lawsuit that they were looking to avoid with Harley Davidson over the Hog name. 24 years ago this week, on August 9th, 1997, one of the most violent matches of all time took place at ECW's Born to be Wired event from the ECW Arena in Philadelphia. This was not a pay-per-view. Highlights of some of the matches aired in the weeks that followed on TV. It was all about the main event. A barbed wire match with Terry Funk defending his ECW World Championship against Sabu. This match is sick and demented. And not even very good. Like, let's just be honest here. I mean, as a match, even if you're a fan of this shit, this was not a good match. And it's hard to do a match like this, especially in this case where these guys are literally wrapped in barbed wire. It's hard to have a good pro wrestling match. Or anything that really is going to be very exciting. But it is memorable for the violence, and Sabu ripping his bicep open on a spot in the corner. He ripped it right open, right down to the muscle. You can see him panic as soon as he realizes how bad the injury is. Then he calls for Bill Alfonso, his manager, to go find some tape so that he can tape the arm up and continue the match. And so Fonzie ran to the back and he grabbed some athletic tape, which is the only tape that he could find. He brought it back down to the ring, and Sabu is taping his arm up. And while he's wrestling, he's trying to sell for Terry Funk. He's trying to sell for his offense while he is still wrapping his arm up. There was a point where Sabu crotched himself on the barbed wire. He wrapped barbed wire around his body. At another point, he dove off the apron with a leg drop onto Funk, who was laid out across a table. And for the finish, both men were wrapped in barbed wire. They were all tangled up. They couldn't do anything. So Sabu just held Funk's shoulders down for the 3 count to win the championship. It took them 20 minutes to cut both of these guys free with wire cutters because of how entangled they were in the wire. Backstage, Fonzie told Hannibal in his shoot interview on the Hannibal TV YouTube channel, he told him that they wanted to take, they being the people in the back, the other wrestlers, wanted to take Sabu to the emergency room once he got backstage, but he refused, and he told them, "Stitch me up right here. No anesthesia, just stitch me up right here." Which is what they did. And he said it took nearly 100 stitches to close the wound on his arm. And about midway through the stitching process, Sabu admitted to Fonzie, "Okay, this hurts." No shit. He said, "This hurts." And he sends Fonzie to go find some super glue. And as he points out in his shoot, these days they have medical grade super glue where you can very safely glue a cut shut to stop it from bleeding. It's pretty amazing the things they have today. But back then, they didn't have that. This was just over-the-counter shit from 7-Eleven that he sent Fonzie to go find. So Fonzie went to 7-Eleven, he bought a tube of super glue, and he gave it to Sabu, and he watched Sabu squeeze out a line of the stuff right down his arm and pinch the skin shut to close the wound. That's hardcore. That's very dumb, but that's hardcore. And Sabu told Chris Van Vliet the two most painful injuries of his career. And think about the ground that covers. Think about the matches, the wars that this man has been in, the scars. You can see the scars all up and down his arms, his chest. He told Chris that the two worst injuries of his career was the time Chris Benoit threw him in the air and he landed and he broke his neck, and the scar that he got on his arm when he wrestled Terry Funk. Paul Heyman told WWE.com years ago that it was the last barbed wire match in ECW history because he could not in good conscience subject anybody else to that level of brutality. For all that he endured here, Sabu's reign as champion lasted all of 8 days before dropping the belt to Shane Douglas. 2 days later, on the August 11th, 1997 episode of Raw is War from Biloxi, Mississippi, Ravishing Rick Rude returned to WWE after a 7-year absence as the new insurance policy for Shawn Michaels, assisting him to a victory over Mankind, and serving as one of the original members of D-Generation X, along with Michaels, Triple H, and Chyna. And I am sure that was done as an inside joke, that he was an insurance policy after he had been collecting money on an actual insurance policy for years through Lloyd's of London due to the back injury he sustained years earlier in WCW. Rude never really, to me, felt like a good fit for DX. He seemed miscast. Didn't really fit that group. And he wasn't with them very long anyhow. WWE had him on a per-appearance deal and not under an actual contract, which is why he was free to sign with WCW after what happened in Montreal. He wanted out in protest of what they did to his friend Bret Hart, and he made history as the first man to ever appear on WWF, WCW, and ECW television in the same week. And also on this show, a moment that turned out to be kind of important, and it came during a match between Farouk and Chains of DOA. Rocky Maivia. He had been the clean-cut, smiling babyface since his debut, which led to chants of "Die Rocky Die" and "Rocky sucks." He suffered a knee injury in June, and he disappeared from television for 2 months, until this match, where he slid into the ring behind the referee's back. There was a ref bump, that's what it was. There was a ref bump, he slid into the ring, he hit Chains with a rock bottom, and he handed the win to Farouk. This was the Rocky Maivia heel turn, joining the Nation of Domination, which gave rise to The Rock,